Papua New Guinea or Indonesia and pay someone not to log a tropical forest. Now, of course, if you pay someone not to log a tropical forest, they'll perfectly happily sell you give you a piece of paper saying, I promise not to log this patch of forest. But we all know in those countries they'll just go and log another patch of forest. It'll have no difference on the actual emissions going on. I spent some time in Indonesia working on logging of tropical forests, and I'll tell you what, the level of corruption is absolutely astonishing. The military owns most of the logging concessions in Indonesia. That's how they supplement their wages. The third outrageous loophole or scam within the CPRS is, of course, the massive amounts of compensation paid to the coal-fired generators and other polluting industries. Now, Treasury must be tearing its hair out. The whole point is to penalise them. The whole point is to drive a wedge between the prices they have to pay and the costs that the new industries are going to have to meet. It's an absolute scandal that the polluter should get paid to continue to pollute. And one of the last that I'll mention, there are several others, outrageous characteristics of the carbon pollution reduction scheme is that the legislation looks like it will create property rights over these permits. There won't be permits, there'll be actual rights. And what that means is when we get serious about the science in a few years' time and realise that 5% reductions are totally inadequate and we must go to 40%, we're going to have all of those polluters out there owning these property rights, and the only way we're going to stop them spending their rights through pollution is to go and buy them back at massive prices. What we're setting up under the CPRS is exactly what state governments did over water rights. Under influence of the National Party, they allocated more rights to the water than there was water in the Murray-Darling. And now, because of that criminal irresponsibility, we have to buy those rights back. And that's exactly the situation that's being set up under the CPRS. Now, let me just, to finish, tell you a little bit of history, which will lead to current events. I've been around long enough in the environmental debate to remember back in the 1980s, when governments in Australia started to get serious about some of the big environmental issues, to remember that there was a very extended debate about the best sorts of policy response to environmental problems. The old style of regulation came under really severe criticism from the economic rationalists and the right-wing think tanks like the IPA. They said this is Stalinist sort of policy. We don't want this anymore. What we want is free market measures. We want economic instruments. And there was a sustained argument that was carried out over 5 to 10 years, which the economic rationalists won hands down. They persuaded governments and policymakers and commentators, pretty much everyone who had influence, that economic instruments were better, and in that I mean emissions trading and carbon taxes when it comes to the greenhouse issue, better because they're cheaper. And as an environmentalist, I was persuaded by that, because I thought the cheaper the cost of reducing emissions, the more we can push to reduce emissions by greater amounts. And so we had the two parties agreeing that these economic instruments were the way to go. And the Greens supported it too, and I still think it's the right thing to do, to have emissions trading over a carbon tax or regulation, though we should supplement with regulation as well in the more difficult areas. Now, the astonishing thing that's happened this week is the new coalition under Tony Abbott, dominated by the sceptics and denialists, has gone back to the era before the 1980s. Tony Abbott said, we will not have emissions trading in this country. We will not have a great big tax. We will not have trading. We will not have a carbon tax. And there's only one set of policies left, and that is Stalinist regulation. The exact sets of policies that Tony Abbott, the IPA, the CIS, and all of the economic rationalists in Canberra said we must get rid of. And so we're back to the future. No ETS, no carbon tax, some other form of regulation, and there's only one outcome from that. If we have the same target, of course, Tony Abbott has said that, and that is it will cost more. There will be more jobs lost under the Abbott coalition than there would be under a policy that pursued economic instruments properly enforced. So we're going backwards in this country. We just went back 30 years this week. And this is in striking contrast to what's happening in the rest of the world, where although progress is slow, and Copenhagen will not under any circumstances go nearly far enough. Nevertheless, in other countries, at least the progress is in the forward direction. Europe, for example, will cut emissions by 20% by 2020, guaranteed, and perhaps 30%, which comes in within the range suggested by the science. Japan has announced it will cut by 25% over 1990 levels by 2020. Canada, where there's a Conservative government, says it will cut by 20% from current levels. And China, of course, is probably doing more in economic terms to cut its emissions than any other country, including Europe, promising to cut its emissions intensity by 40 to 45% from current levels by 2020. But what's happening in Australia against this international progress? We have a pathetic carbon pollution reduction scheme from the government in power, and we have a coalition in denial that will in fact do bugger all about Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. What this means is that as the rest of the world is moving forward, albeit far too slowly, Australia will free ride on the rest of the world. We won't be pulling our weight. We won't be undertaking our moral responsibility. We used to complain, we on the green side of the fence, that Australia was a climate laggard. Well, I think we need a new term for Australia, the sort of Australia that we're going to be over the next few years, and that is climate bludgers. We're going to be bludgeoned on the rest of the world as they pull their weight, or at least part of it, and we do virtually nothing. We're just going to ride on the coattails of the rest of the world. The Greens, of course, promise strong leadership on climate. 40% emission cuts, meet the scientific demands. The sorts of outline we've had from zero emissions is, I think, absolutely fantastic and inspirational. And it's because of that. It's because of we need to do it and because we can do it, but because we're meeting these massive blockages in the political process. And the blockage, of course, is provided by that great clump of bottom-dwelling people called the climate mafia, the greenhouse mafia in Canberra. And so it's to try to break that blockage that I decided to do my bit in running in Higgins, and we hope that on Saturday we can send a strong message to Canberra to kick out the greenhouse mafia and do what we must. Thank you.